Welcome to Pharma Insights Unplugged, a podcast focused on the evolving world of medical affairs and the work that shapes patient impact beyond the label. In today's episode, we are joined by Dr. Anurita Majumdar, Global Senior Medical Director Respiratory at GSK, with over 2 decades of experience across India, Asia, emerging market, and global medical affairs, clinical development, and evidence generation. Dr. Majumdar has led medical strategy across multiple therapy areas and geographies. In this conversation, we are going to explore perspectives around data generation for assets that are mature or approaching the later stages of their life cycle. So, welcome, Dr. Anurita Majumdar. How are you doing today?
Thank you, Amit. It's my pleasure to join you on this podcast, and I'm doing good, and I hope you're doing well too.
So, Dr. Majumdar, when an asset is mature or nearing an end of life, what are the key decision triggers that tell you it's worth investing in new evidence generation rather than maintaining the status quo?
Thank you, Amit, for that question. And I think that's a very, very important decision for any organization to continue to invest in evidence generation at a stage is almost nearing end of life cycle. So few aspects of the decision making. First of all is whether the asset is still in the growing or not. When it's nearing end of life cycle in a major market such as US, it still has growth potential in other regions. Second, are there still unmet needs? There's still data gaps. What's the competitors doing? So it depends on which class of product it is, and the competitors are also investing in evidence generation. There is still some unmet need from patients and physicians' perspective. And the third is that whether those evidence generation has a potential to make some differences in the therapy area where it is currently positioned. Do those evidence generation have the potential to influence or inform changes in treatment decisions? So those key aspects are taken into consideration while deciding data generation, even at a mature stage in the life cycle.
So, there is a parallel activity of competitive intelligence also that goes on and that somehow impacts this particular decision making.
Absolutely. That's very, very important. And why that is important is not just because you want to stay competitive, which of course is a business decision, but if you know that there is unmet need and that is being generated by your competitors, then you would also want to know how you want to enhance the science and the therapy area where you're operating. And that evidence will have the potential to help physicians take more informed decisions, but also for the guideline makers, and even from a access perspective, does that help in positioning the treatment better?
So, at this stage of the life cycle, how do you define impactful data and how do you balance impact across patients, clinicians, say payers or HTA bodies, regulators, and internal brand strategy?
Yeah, so obviously, as you would imagine, that a data generation strategy is never done in isolation, right? It is part of the overall the brand strategy, the therapy area strategy, and also to see what are the other drugs in that class and where it is it positioned. So how would you define an impactful data generation strategy is, as I think said in my previous question, is whether the evidence that comes out is taking the treatment decisions a step forward, which means that whatever evidence was known, not just of this product, but in that therapy area, let's say oncology or diabetes or respiratory, right? So the current treatment decisions or current opportunities may have a gap. That means that despite all the treatment options available, that physicians are not able to achieve as much of the treatment goals as they want to. So an impactful data generation is one that could fill that gap. Either helps to differentiate the product better within the class so that the physicians are able to choose the right treatment, or provide more evidence on how to enhance treatment goals. Let's say in respiratory, if only exacerbation is a treatment goal, is that enough? Or do you need to have more composite endpoints to achieve even better for patients? And third, I would say what is the gold standard in any evidence generation is that is this information helping to inform treatment guidelines?
True. Yeah, eventually, if one can impact on the guidelines, that's the thing like every medical affairs personnel look forward to. So, what are the most common mistakes teams make when planning or executing the late life cycle evidence generation?
So I would probably answer it differently. I would say what needs to be factored in
Okay.
to ensure that we are able to generate an impactful data. So first is that it should be based on insights. And now, of course, you are also in the real world evidence space. You know that we have far evolved tools, AI, to give us insights. So we really need to know, exactly the data gaps. It should be validated in the key markets where you want this data to be communicated. Second is, it's very important. Of course, ambition is important. We all are ambitious, but you also have to be pragmatic. That, let's say, if the asset is in a matured stage of life cycle, and I would want to do a prospective RCT. A prospective RCT, will need a large sample size, will read out in 2 years. That may not be the most appropriate strategy for an asset in the late life cycle. So we'll have to look at more innovative real world designs.
Right.
So sometimes I would think that if those factors are not considered, then even if the evidence is good, but it comes later, it might not be impactful. Also, having a proper understanding of what is the standard of care versus which you're comparing, have other methodological designs very robust. So balancing pace and scientific rigor together is very important. And when that is not done, that could lead to either a evidence that may not be easily accepted by HCPs, payers, or by any other authorities who decide on treatments. And if it takes too long, then perhaps it's not appropriate for the life cycle of the asset.
Right. Like as you mentioned about AI, and these days, like we are also doing few projects on the sentiment analysis or the social media listening. We are trying to set up few frameworks in order to get things on table from the patient's view. So any particular views on those aspects of real world evidence? Because eventually we are just trying to understand using AI that what people are talking about in real world, be it their unmet need or what they are looking for, or how much they are satisfied, or any kind of quality of life.
So I'm not a subject matter expert on that, but I would
Okay.
say that definitely for insights, social media listening is a very, very important way of collecting insights from not just physicians, but also from patients. What exactly do they look for in their treatments? In chronic diseases, it's very important. I work in respiratory, which is a chronic disease, previously worked in oncology, cardiovascular disease. There, most patients have to take their treatment for a really long period of time, sometimes even lifelong. So social media listening helps us to know what patients are seeking in their treatment. What exactly are they missing in their treatment? And when you know that, that is an important aspect of how you design your data generation strategy. So it's not just physicians, it's also what patients want, what the public wants, what gives them a good quality of life. Again, I'll come back to respiratory. Just is it controlling flare-ups? Is that enough? Patients might want far more from their treatment. They want to live a very, very active life. So how do you then provide the evidence for the physician for them to then help patients achieve what they want, their treatment goals? It's not easy for pharma companies to reach out directly to patients, but
Right.
these social media listening helps us bridge that gap.
So talking about budgets, we always know that medical affairs, they always have a limited budget. So when budgets and timelines are constrained, so how do you decide between real world evidence? We talked about pragmatic trials or registries or any kind of a post hoc analysis. And how do you align endpoints to maximize the impact?
Yes, so obviously planning data generation aligned with budgets needs a lot of prioritization and strategic thinking. The first is exactly which country and which region will be the most important countries where this data will be disseminated. So we prioritize. So and that clearly is based on the business decision. So is it meant for US? Is it meant for Europe? Is it meant for China or Japan? So that's where the prioritization happens. The second is again the timeline. When do we need that and by when? So we design that. And the third is that this evidence is not just for scientific communication. Being in a pharma company, it's also important that that evidence could be communicated in platforms, both promotional and non-promotional. So all of these factors are taken. So the endpoints should be able to differentiate the asset versus what was previously done. Okay, so that's very important. Second, if that endpoint is then communicated into a promotional strategy, then it should help experts or physicians make a decision for that product. And then you decide where the budget should lie. For instance, a product is one amongst 3 or 4 products within the class. right? And previously, no head to head studies were done, no RCTs. Well, then a comparative effectiveness has to be done, because without that, you would not be able to differentiate. If you're only looking for what happens before and after, then maybe a single arm pre-post kind of study needs to be done. So that's how the endpoints and the designs are done. Again, which is the priority country, what's the unmet need, and of course the timelines.
So in that situation, I think when we talk about ITCs, indirect treatment comparisons, or network meta-analysis, so that perhaps can play a role in bringing out the evidence, if I'm right.
Yes, if there are no pre-existing randomized controlled studies between products within a class, but there is some evidence to know that yes, they may all be in the class, but they're not same. Maybe the molecules are different, something is different. Then how do you differentiate? So within that, you can have indirect treatment comparisons such as network meta-analysis, or you could have comparative effectiveness study. Now, both have their pros and their cons. Now, indirect treatment comparisons, they are very complex statistical methodologies. And it depends on, it's like garbage in, garbage out. So what sort of studies we've considered in the network, and that has been subject of criticisms. We've seen that sometimes they are very well accepted, but sometimes we've seen conflicting results with network meta-analysis despite the objectives being similar. So we've done then comparative effectiveness, and we found there, at least if you have selected the right database and you've done the right statistical rigor, that still gives far more acceptable outcomes. Do they have limitations? Of course. There is a generalizability. You do it in one geography, the other geography says our healthcare system. So yes, they do come with their limitations, but they are still better, at least higher in the evidence hierarchy than network meta-analysis.
In continuation with the previous one, how should evidence strategies be tailored for different external stakeholders, such as HTA bodies like NICE, now you are in UK, then clinical guideline committees and local healthcare systems without fragmenting the overall value narrative?
Yeah, so that's I would say a everyday challenge that all organizations face. Guideline committees, at least the guideline committees with whom we have interacted, they definitely rely more on clinical trials, RCTs primarily, or
Gold standard.
network meta-analysis of RCTs. Okay. So for them, obviously, and it's very clear, the guideline committees lay out, the highest weightage is given to at least one or two pivotal RCTs or RCTs, then NMAs of RCTs, then they go to post hoc analysis of RCTs, and then probably to real world studies. And within real world studies, then obviously the least importance is given to case studies or opinion papers. For access decision making, some of it is relevant for some access, but they would want to see more cost effectiveness. And you would know, you're an expert there. For them, it is okay, fine, this treatment is better than this treatment in this clinical endpoint, but is that translating into cost effectiveness benefits? And so for them, that's what is important. So obviously, a study that may inform treatment changes from a guideline perspective may not be the right study from a cost effectiveness and access perspective. So and payers then within that system is a very, very complex. For instance, some of the endpoints that we talk about in treatment goals, payers are not so keen on that unless you can directly show that yes, these treatment goals, once achieved, are also reducing healthcare costs.
Exactly. We rather did a comparative study wherein we tried to figure out, when it comes to the endpoints, the regulatory endpoints requirement was different as compared to the payers' endpoints, because their perspective is more towards the reimbursement and bringing out the cost effectiveness. So yes, I totally get this.
For instance, would want to see whether the treatment of standard of care has been enhanced. And the payers and the access, for them, it is the cost. So different stakeholders have a very different need. By and large, at least from where I have worked, medical affairs, our focus is largely on healthcare providers and with the guideline committees, but definitely we have an access team that looks at more of the outcomes, which is more important from an access perspective.
So in chronic diseases such as respiratory conditions, where do you see the biggest unaddressed evidence gaps for established therapies today?
So my experience in respiratory is in the last 4.5 years, and but before that, I worked with other chronic therapies, especially in cardiovascular disease and other non-communicable diseases. I think the the biggest evidence gap is that the endpoints of studies, which is for registration purpose, are not necessarily the right endpoints which is required to improve the life and outcome of the patients. And again, I'll come back to respiratory. Let's say exacerbation is an important endpoint which is necessary for registration. So to show whether it is any chronic respiratory conditions, especially asthma and COPD, it's important to show a better exacerbation. But is that enough to kind of enhance the life of the patient suffering from asthma and COPD? No, you have to see how long the patient's lung function is maintained. Is the lung function deteriorating? Because that has other effects. Is the quality of life, some of those controls are maintained? So that's where we see limited evidence in those aspects of patient's life which, let's say, are not so relevant to get the product registered and communicate the science more from a business perspective. I've seen also in diabetes and in hypertension, which is why non-interventional studies, phase 4 non-interventional studies, become very important.
True.
That's where you are able to answer these unmet needs, which, let's say, you will not be able to address during the initial development phase. And that's where the decision of budget, impactful evidence comes. Organizations are really moving in that direction. My current organization, I see a lot of emphasis on phase 4 studies are now being made for us to keep addressing these unmet needs, even after the product has achieved its registration milestones.
Excellent point. And when we talk about real world evidence, so what companies usually prefer? Observational studies, prospective ones, or they are equally fine when it comes to the retrospective database analysis?
It all depends on the data generation strategy. And I answered that previously, the timelines. Prospective studies definitely come with a higher cost and a longer timelines. So retrospective database studies definitely are a very, very key tool to address data gaps within a reasonable amount of time if done with the correct statistical methodologies and rigor. They come with a strong set of limitations, which database has been chosen, what are the components of those databases. So
True.
I obviously cannot talk about a lot of organizations, but I know that the organization that I represent has really understands how to balance where to put investment in RCT, where in retrospective database studies. And I'm sure most organizations are thinking in that direction.
Coming on to the last question for today's podcast. So, as a take home message for medical affairs teams, what are the core principles or pillars that should guide evidence generation strategy for mid to late life cycle assets?
That's what I think started with. So I would say, first of all, the life cycle of an asset cannot be the only factor for the data generation strategy. It depends on, is the asset still is growing? Is it growing in major markets and regions? Does it have a growth potential? What are the data gaps that are existing? And third is, what's the competitive space? All together should decide the evidence generation strategy. So as medical affairs, our role is to first be absolutely vigilant of the insights of the unmet need from experts, physicians, and bring them back into the strategy when we are developing that. Of course, there is a business decision, so the business case is very important, and also ensure that the data evidence is generated within a pace and time and communicated. The most important aspect of medical affairs is not just to complete the data generation, but an impactful communication strategy of that data. So that's what I would say the key message is: to be aware of what the unmet need is, to be aware of what the competition is doing, be absolutely mindful of whether there is a growth potential, and then bring back those insights into the strategy, but generate impactful data at pace, but communicate also at pace.
And the communication perhaps also includes the dissemination part as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. So data dissemination through congresses and through any other medical affairs platforms, even through digital platforms. So even it doesn't matter if we have less MSLs, because it's a late life cycle asset. So obviously there will be probably less on field and medical affairs staff on the ground. But again, that's where technology comes in. There would be through digital platforms, different omni-channel platforms, it should be
Right.
communicated.
This was an excellent podcast. I'm really happy to have you here and you share your valuable insights. And this is actually the first podcast of this year. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we hope that you do well in your new role in UK, and wish you luck for everything.
Thank you, Amit. It was also a pleasure talking to you. As I said, it's a very, very relevant topic and something that I'm really passionate about. I do hope that the ones who listen to this podcast do get some insights in their day to day medical affairs work. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye bye.